Take your seats, please.
Yeah, I can hear you. What do you mean?
Good morning from my side.
Okay, and I see no one, so it sounds like I'm talking to myself, but I'm happy to continue.
I would like to also welcome you all to the General Assembly, and it's good to see faces that are familiar and faces that are also new as we meet here to serve the continent again together. I will be moving into the next session of our program, and I do believe we all have copies of the program in front of us. We will be taking a keynote presentation from one of our key speakers and supporter to the work of ECOSOCC, who is in no other person than Mr. Brian Bright Kagoro, the Managing Director and Programs for Open Society Foundation. He will be speaking on the topic, ECOSOCC's role in curating a new Africa narrative. Shall we welcome him with a round of applause, please? Mr. Kagoro, please take the floor. 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 Mr. Kagoro, please take the floor.
Right? Okay. Sorry, that was an the leadership of ECOSOCC. Sorry, but there's an echo. Bright, can you hear me? There's an echo.
I think
Is it just
if everything is in order, I think we can start now. It looks like technology is not being friendly to us this morning, but I do believe our technicians will be able to put us in a
let me know when we're ready, yeah?
Just say something.
Hi, my name is Kagoro. Happy to be with my comrades at ECOSOCC.
Yes, it's okay now. Please go
Should
ahead.
I continue talking?
Yes, please.
Proceed.
Yes, please.
I can proceed?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Thank you so much to the leadership of ECOSOCC for the invitation to come and interact with you all this morning, and a particular thanks to William Karu, Nana, Dr. Raj, and His Excellency Bright, and the political leadership of ECOSOCC, esteemed participants and excellencies. Welcome to Nairobi. I would have wished to be with you in Nairobi, but I am in a very cold Warsaw. Today I wanted to reflect on not just celebrating 20 years of ECOSOCC, but to reflect on what this means, having been privileged to have been in Maputo at the discussion in 2003, where pertinent issues were being raised, and the lessons that we've learned since that journey. I want to perhaps title my brief presentation, Another Africa, a Better Africa is Long Overdue. The new ECOSOCC imperative. So another Africa, a better Africa is long overdue. The new ECOSOCC imperative. Chinua Achebe suggests that we're not the children of Africa. We are its parents. The Africa we want and deserve is yet to be born, and it is our obligation to give birth to that Africa. The Africa we currently have has some of the most youthful population. It has resilient economies. Sorry about that. The Africa we currently have has resilient economies. It has $2.4 trillion worth of pension funds. $53 billion comes into this continent by way of FDI. Its diaspora remits $96 billion. Its fossil fuel consumption subsidies sit at $182 billion. Yet its government revenues sit at $466 billion. The Africa we currently have is an Africa that imports almost $70 to $80 billion worth of food annually, and yet it has some of the most arable agricultural land. The Africa we have imports in excess of $130 billion worth of fertilizers annually, and yet it has phosphates and nitrates enough to produce what it needs. So in talking about ECOSOCC and this fundamental moment we are in, it's useful to remember what Kwame Nkrumah said. Nkrumah, on the 12th of June 1949, said there is no force, however formulated, that a united people cannot overcome. And he also, in writing about the challenge of the Congo, says the true nature of the struggle taking place in Africa and the world is between the forces of progress and those of reaction. And that struggle, according to Kwame Nkrumah, is in the final analysis the fight of the common man against injustice and privilege. And Nkrumah concludes in his epochal essay entitled The Same. He says, I do not know of any greater satisfaction than honest and efficient service rendered to the people in the best interest of all people. My own brother and the former supporter of ECOSOCC, the late Dr. Tajuddin Abdul Rahim, was Secretary General of the Global Pan-African Movement, said the following: the collective African experience is that we can only be ourselves, and we need each other to counter the threat of marginalization, rapacious globalization, and the consolidation of whatever little gains may have been accomplished in a number of countries. No one country can be a sustainable miracle if its neighbors are in hell. And I want to suggest that these are the mindsets and attitudes we must carry in engaging current complexity, African complexity. We continue to face complex governance situations which have 5 identical characteristics. Unresolved state building and nation building projects that manifest in the form of conflict, weak diversity management, ethnic, racial, religious, generational, gender, and ideological, that manifests in forms of state capture, in forms of electoral and democracy capture, weak state, weak institutions, weak constitutions, and severe capacity constraints. Our economies have, despite the potential that I've described, continued to be characterized by various levels of enclavity, exclusion, and deep inequality. So the socio-economic and political fragility in Africa are intertwined. Unaccountable governance, disregard for human rights, violations of the rule of law have perhaps been more stuck in those countries where civil society has increasingly been weakened, civic space closed, and the private sector has been severely circumscribed by political patronage and sometimes suffocated by unpredictable regulations and just downright sheer corruption. But what is clear to a Pan-Africanist like me is that we are no longer Europe's dark continent, nor are we a hopeless continent. And this is why, until recently, Europe and America viewed Africa as marginal, of little political interest. During a 2000 presidential campaign, you will recall George Bush famously dismissing Africa as being a part of the world where the U.S. had no real interest. And more recently, the Donald Trump...
Recording in progress.
Donald Trump, who has just returned to power, characterized some African countries as shitholes. However, over the last few years or so, emerging powers have nearly dislodged Euro-American political and economic dominance in Africa. This has led to radical revision of Euro-American attitudes towards Africa, from hopeless continent to this next global growth pole. Now, this next global growth pole
narrative does not always bring joy. It does not always mean that there is benefit for Africans. So the growth rates recorded by African economies and the renewed Euro-American economic and political interest in Africa is more about the success of South-South economic partnerships. And I wish to underscore this because this newfound interest and hope and optimism regarding Africa has largely, but not exclusively, been stimulated by the phenomenal growth of countries like China, India, Brazil, and their long-standing and growing economic links with Africa. So, Africa has phenomenal opportunities in this moment, which include new markets in which to sell their goods, alternative sources of financing and assistance, increased ability to lower their dependence on traditional partners, e.g. Europe and the US, reducing the focus on the old relations of ex-colonial powers, the US, as well as dependence on ODA or aid, leveraging new partnerships in order to diversify economies with significant increase in trade, FDI, from the South-South partners, but also technology transfer. Friends, if the world economic map is changing, how is ECOSOCC's membership changing? How is ECOSOCC's membership reflecting what future economies will look like? If you read the Economic Intelligence Unit, if you read the World Bank and the IMF projections of the world in 2050, they list China as the world's leading economy, followed by the United States, followed by India, by Brazil, Mexico, Russia, Indonesia, Japan, United Kingdom, and Germany, in that order. There is not a single African country that's lifted in these projections. And yet, in the current reality, in the narratives about Africa joining the G20, in the narratives about both the African Union and South Africa being in a lead pole position to host the G20, it is clear that if emerging South global powers or global South powers are fast becoming the most important economic partners of Africa, we must strengthen the people-to-people relationships with these powers. These emerging powers, with the exception of South Korea, do not belong to the club of traditional aid givers, the OECD, DAC. These include Argentina, Australia, Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, and etc. The world and times are changing. The dominance of the West is as precarious as the notion of a unipolar world dominated by the USA. The balance of power in world trade has veered towards the global South, and indeed the global South has become the most important investor in Africa, e.g. 50% of global trade used to be north-north, coming from the global North in 2000, and these flows were more than 3 times larger than the South-South trade. But by 2010, by contrast, South-South and North-North trade were equal, and now South-South trade has surpassed North-South trade. So India and China are not new in Africa. And this is what is very important. I wish to underscore that as we talk about governance, as we talk about politics, it is important for the leadership and the membership of ECOSOCC to realize that civil society or constructs of civil society that do not include economic society, the small to medium scale producer, the trade unions, and etc., becomes a fraught and weak notion of civil society. So the most prominent South-South partners in Africa today, China, India, Iran, Korea, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey. If you think about what is their contribution towards trade, because when we think about AFCFTA and think about African citizens participating in AFCFTA and benefiting meaningfully from AFCFTA, we have to think about what is the trade ratio, what is the trade balance between Africa and these non-OECD trade partners. So China is 42% plus, India 14%, Korea 5.2%, Brazil 5.1%, Turkey 6.5%. So if China has become Africa's main bilateral trading partner, and the gap continues to broaden as Chinese trade with Africa grows, what are, in terms of security, What are, in terms of governance, what are, in terms of human rights, the issues that must underscore the engagement, the people-to-people engagement between China and Africa, between Brazil and Africa, between India and Africa. Do we wish our relationships with these powers to be qualitatively different from the West? So how do we act, talk, and have them invest differently? And the question in most African minds, is it better to be exploited by Chinese, Saudi, Indian, or Brazilian capitalist than a British or American one? Or should the system of production, should the system of economic growth be different? I want to suggest the following. The fundamental questions I am raising for the ECOSOCC leadership and membership are the following. Power, social, political, economic, and military, determines the contours of governance, of justice or injustice, and transformation. So if power determines the contours of injustice or justice or transformation, poverty and political repression determines the capacity of a collective of people to address questions of injustice or to address questions of economic transformation. In other words, when people are disempowered by poverty, inequality, and political repression, they are unable to gain the sort of negotiation power with whoever they are trading with or relating with economically. So unjust economic power relations, lack of accountability and exclusion, essentially will lead to forms of anti-establishment sentiments, protest and revolution. However, direct agency and leadership of citizens in their own liberation, which means citizens participating not only in questions of political liberation or political or civil and political rights, but social and economic rights, becomes a fundamental question, such that entities like ECOSOCC cannot purely be concerned about rights or human rights, this dualism utility of neoconservative and progressive forces, but should be concerned about how the economy determines the contours of rights and of power of African citizens, so that economic governance becomes a central pillar of the conversations within ECOSOCC. Those who are elected to ECOSOCC's leadership do not only occupy leadership in order to attend meetings and to make speeches at meetings, but they do so in order to determine qualitatively and quantitatively what ought to be the future of Africa and Africa of the future in economic terms. Why? In a volatile world, in an unpredictable global political economy, which is seeing financialization of globalization, which is seeing hegemony and protectionism returning to many of the global north countries, which is characterized by this new scramble for Africa, or a recolonization, if you choose to call it that, and which is also seeing a realignment of the world, moving from non-alignment to some form of alignment to multiple alignment, essentially means we cannot have concepts, we cannot have approaches to the world that are purely or that are simplistic as civil society, that are either purely pro-Western or pro-Eastern or pro-Middle Eastern. We need a nuanced world that actually says we will relate with all those who have interest in Africa in order to project African interests and to protect African rights. The ideology of underdevelopment, colleagues, though, still has to deal with questions of patriarchy and gender repression in our community. It still has to deal with ethnicity, with class and race issues in our own community. It still has to deal with questions of xenophobia that we saw in places like Afrophobia that we saw in places like South Africa. It still has to deal with the new populism amongst ourselves within the continent, where we are seeing fundamentalism and youth violent extremism. But it has to have an ideology of internationalism. No other body other than ECOSOCC and our colleagues who are in the diaspora unit are able to deal with this question of an internationalist African civil society that begins to align with other peoples of the global south, that begins to align with other people who come from the Caribbean, from Europe and elsewhere, persons of African descent, to articulate an African global citizenship in the context of a rapacious globalization that I describe. African predatory elites, African vampire states, the external interests in Africa's real economy, the challenges with distribution and redistribution, the challenges of development governance, the challenges of democracy and democratization, of clientelism, of kleptocracy and plutocracy. This conflation we've seen in places of state, party, military, and economy. The preoccupation historically in civil society with technicism, with performance, and etc., essentially means, and I want to underscore this to my colleagues at ECOSOCC, an ECOSOCC without politics, an ECOSOCC without a vision and a vision of Africa, an ECOSOCC without an internationalist mindset, an ECOSOCC that's preoccupied purely with localized fights within how to democratize the state and how to deal with the state capture, maybe an ECOSOCC that's not fit for the future. Most African countries are going through both transition and a series of successions. We saw in Botswana a response to the establishment by citizens who elected a new political party. We saw recently in Ghana a response to the establishment. But we have been seeing various forms of responses, which have ranged from street protests to military takeovers to now more democratic forms that I think should be encouraged. But these responses to the establishment, by and large, often are responses to personalities and individuals. We need to deepen these responses so that they are responses to the international order that creates a division of labor between the developed world and the developing world, such that questions of local democracy, human rights, rule of law, and access to justice must also be coupled within the space of ECOSOCC with conversation of international democracy, international governance, international rule of law, and international justice. And there are some of us who, in seizing on the theme of the year of the African Union for 2025, insist that African citizens must seek a repair or reparations for the injustices Africans have done to themselves and to each other, but must also seek reparations for what others have done to us. It does not suffice to grow political amnesia with respect to injustices that have been done to Africa and continue to be done to Africa and persons of African descent. There must be a capacity within ECOSOCC to tackle the questions of adherence to and compliance with the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance, the Human Rights Strategy for Africa, the African Charter on Values and Principles of the Public Service, the African Charter that talks about decentralization and local governance, the AU shared values. And we must, though, within ECOSOCC, ideologically contest the idea that neoliberalism is our inevitable end. The developments in Angola, in Burundi, in Central African Republic, in DRC, in Egypt, in Libya, in Mali, in Mozambique, in Kenya, and South Africa, tells us that no one is going to get another headache from Africa. They want to stabilize Africa at all costs or simply to ignore it. Sudan, which has seen the largest displacement of citizens, remains not as top a priority in global conversation. We will not become anybody else's priority until we become our own priorities. But I wish to sound a warning to civil society groups. You are no longer the sole traders in hope. In some instances, you have seen militarized regimes, you have seen churches, you have seen jihadists, you have seen philanthropists, single activists on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram. Social media activists become the new face of social struggles. Bureaucratizing ECOSOCC meetings, having hyper pettiness around the importance that's built around appointment in AU things will not deal with the fundamental challenge I wish to leave with you. The memory of slavery, of colonialism and apartheid, of imperialism, neocolonialism, of dictatorship of the Cold War, of structural adjustment programs that ruined our economies and created a lot of redundancies, of regime change, of patriarchy, of racism and tribalism. Whilst these frame our social struggles, it is important that the imagination of sustainable development, of a global Africa, of regional integration, of Agenda 2063++, of economic structural transformation, of Africa in the fourth and fifth industrial revolution, Africa engaging artificial intelligence and regenerative AI, not as a victim, not as a consumer, but as an owner, a controller, a programmer, becomes important. And this essentially means, colleagues, that the tension arising out of our attempt to reconcile ancient societies with imposed nation states, that of nation building, takes on a new meaning in the age of technology and the digital age. Tension amongst different identities within the nation state, the diversity burden, seems to be taking on a new meaning where we're seeing young people, whether they call themselves Gen Z or something else, organizing beyond ethnicity, beyond religion, around issues of mutual consent. This idea that issue-based politics becomes central as opposed to personality politics. The tension of trying to empower citizens in relation to comprador or hybrid regimes, the democratization question, must not only become the localized question, but it must become globalized and regionalized. It is not only about dealing with changes in our own countries. We must appreciate the international forces that enable local kleptocracy and local lack of democraticness. The challenges of trying to empower African states in relation to the global governance system, the equal and mutual partnership ambition for Africa, essentially means African citizens cannot afford to only have a one-track relationship with the African state, a relationship of hostility. We must remember, as inconvenient, as dysfunctional, as repressive sometimes as African states may be, it is the sole vehicle we have for negotiating in this context of global power, where dominance of the other in an Africa which ideally should be exercising leadership is key. Public order versus human rights, development versus democracy, justice versus peace. The questions of impunity cannot be shied away from. The world is no longer a liberal democracy. If I were in the West, I would have said, who moved our cheese as ECOSOCC, or who moved our cheese as civil society? But perhaps let's say who moved our fufu, our pounded yam, our egusi soup, our ugali, our nyama. This world where we are seeing elections only recycle and sometimes sanitize the same group of elites who have become stockholders in our countries. This world where change as a narrative has been expropriated by global finance capital, right-wing forces, and repressive, thieving African elites. This world where neoliberal economic reforms, now fully embraced by most of our countries, with token reference to social protection and hardly any reference to equality, equity, and ownership in the real economy. This world where international economic relations are preoccupied with countering each other, or where you now have new forms of violence and new forms of disinformation and misinformation, requires an ECOSOCC that is technically competent, requires an ECOSOCC that not only uses technology, but an ECOSOCC that begins to create technology platforms, to own technology platforms, to invest technology platforms. It requires an ECOSOCC whose membership reflects the diverse demography of Africa, especially the youthful demography with their multiplicity of skills. This world I'm describing requires an ECOSOCC that centers the leadership of African women who have shown courageously over time that they are the architects, true architects of peace. Courageously over time, they are the true architects of economic reimagination, and they are the ones sustaining local communities in the face of the onslaught of extractive industry. This world requires an ECOSOCC which is not only skilled in protest politics, but an ECOSOCC that's able to do propositional politics, an ECOSOCC that is able to engage within Africa and beyond Africa, but an ECOSOCC that's able to build a bridge between the African diaspora and the Africans on the continent. An ECOSOCC that is able to build a bridge between African academics and think tanks and African frontline strugglers. An ECOSOCC that balances those who struggle for human rights, the right to the environment, the right to ecology, who struggle against climate change, with also those that are trying to create wealth, the small to medium scale producers. Friends, the risk society of global insecurity, militarism and climate change, national instability, extractivism, social disruption, the irrelevance of the law and state in certain areas, judicialization of politics and politicization of the judiciary, militarization and militarism in society requires an ECOSOCC that is not only able to analyze the global political economy, but that understand the local development imperatives. It essentially means that those who are elected to ECOSOCC cannot be the same quality and caliber as those in my generation who could have been elected to ECOSOCC. It requires a thinking ECOSOCC, a doing ECOSOCC. It requires an ECOSOCC that is able to do diplomacy, but an ECOSOCC that's also able to mobilize, to galvanize, an ECOSOCC that becomes a platform not only of advice, but a platform of co-created solutions. I thank you for the opportunity to speak about what I see as the imperatives. I have avoided talking about the litany of African problems, and I hope in the remarks I have made, I've been able to say the Africa we wish to be born is an Africa that can only be given birth to by ECOSOCC and related organizations. How? By broadening the social base of sovereignty, which is democratization at the national level, democratization at the sub-regional and regional level. By deepening the economic base of sovereignty through economic development. The collective development and security on a regional basis, African regional integration. Sovereignty, therefore, has international economic and political context. Sovereignty must therefore respond to national questions as well as global questions. There can be no sovereignty without human development. And Walter Rodney, that brother of ours from Guyana, wrote in 1972, development in human society is a many-sided process. At the level of the individual, it implies increased skill, capacity, greater freedom, creativity, self-discipline, responsibility, and material well-being. The achievement of any of these aspects of personal development is very much tied in the state of society as a whole. The relations which develop within any given social group are crucial to an understanding of society as a whole. Freedom, responsibility, and skill have real meaning only in terms of relations of human beings in society. At the level of social groups, therefore, development implies an increasing capacity to regulate both internal and external relationships. I thank you, and I wish you a great meeting.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brian Bright Kagoro, for this remarkable speech that he's given us. I think there was a lot in there for us to take, touching on very, very relevant issues, including the role of civil society in our communities, state building, in consolidating electoral and governance gains around the continent, the African Union and South Africa's role in the current G20, important role of the AFCFTA and how important Africa is now in the trading sector, challenges, importance of the diaspora as well as Africans' key global players, women issues were touched on: gender, women, the youth, the aged, disabled, among others, were all touched on. I think these are very important issues. But the main takeaway from his speech was a challenge to our civil societies in this room, that being members of ECOSOCC should not end in our meetings, but rather being change makers out there wherever we find ourselves. We need to influence policies as much as possible so that our presence will also be felt in every corner that we may be. We do appreciate him and thank him very well for the speech. We will be taking about 3 to 4 reactions, if there are any, from our colleagues before we move into the next session of the program. Any reactions to the speech? I see 4 hands. I see representative from Zambia, Egypt. I see Sudan and Ethiopia. So we'll start with Zambia.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Moderator, and thank you so very much to Mr. Kagoro for that thought-provoking but yet inspiring speech. I just wanted a quick clarification. He stated that, is he online? Okay. He stated that liberal democracy is now over. I hope I understood him correctly. But as he was talking about the way forward for Africa, he spoke about a greater sense of sovereignty that is embedded in the population and that has to be democratized. I just wanted clarification from a conceptual point of view. When he says that liberal democracy is dead, and yet for us to broaden sovereignty, we have to democratize society, is there not a disconnect between the two? Or how does he reconcile the statement that liberal democracy is dead and the need for Africans to broaden sovereignty by way of democratizing society? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we go to the next delegate from Egypt, when you are speaking, please move the mic a bit away from you because it gives a bit of interference to the interpreters on the other side. Thank you. Our delegate from Egypt, please.
شكرا ليك وشكرا على العرض اللي قدمه بيرين. بأكد على أهمية بأكد على أهمية الإيكوسوك ودوره سواء في إنهاء الإرث الاستعماري كما ذكر بيرين في كلمته، وأن هناك توجهات عالمية الآن وكما قال الأمين العام للأمم المتحدة أن في توجهات لتعويض القارة الإفريقية عن الأضرار وعن الانتهاكات اللي تعرضت ليها على مدار 140 سنة. من هنا يظهر أهمية وجودنا إحنا كمنظمات مجتمع مدني، سواء بنشتغل على المستوى المحلي أو الإقليمي أو الدولي. فكرة التفاوض سواء مع الاتحاد الأوروبي أو مع الدول الأوروبية والدول العظمى لتعويض القارة الإفريقية عن الانتهاكات اللي ارتكبوها سواء على المستوى الاقتصادي أو على المستوى حقوق الإنسان بشكل عام. وكما قلت إن كان في مؤتمر في برلين منذ أيام لمحاولة مناقشة تعويض القارة الإفريقية والأفارقة عن الانتهاكات اللي تعرضوا ليها، ولكن كان حديث المفوضة الأوروبية قالت إن التعويض مش من شأن المفوضية الأوروبية، ولكن التعويض هو من شأن الدول الأوروبية تتناقش في ده مع الدول الإفريقية. من هنا هيظهر أهمية كبيرة للإيكوسوك ولينا كمنظمات بنشتغل على مستوى إقليمي وعلى مستوى دولي إن احنا نشارك في هذه المفاوضات للحديث عن تعويضات للقارة يمكن ألمانيا حتى الآن لم تعوض على الانتهاكات اللي ارتكبتها والأبادة اللي ارتكبتها من 1904. حاجة التانية الشركات الأمنية والعسكرية، الشركات التجارية، الفساد اللي خسر القارة الأفريقية 88 مليار دولار طبقا للإحصائيات في سنة 2002. فأنا أؤيد وأشجع إن إحنا لازم يكون لنا دور في الإيكوسوك لمواجهة هذه التدخلات ولاحترام حقوق الإنسان ولإحلال الديمقراطية. شكرا.
Thank you very much. I also share in your thoughts, and I do believe ECOSOC would have a key role, especially moving into the 2025 theme of the year, which focuses on exactly what you had mentioned as well. We take a delegate from Ethiopia.
Thank you very much. My name is Masoud, and I come from the Consortium of Ethiopian Human Rights Organizations. Thank you for the thought-provoking statement and very inspiring. I found it to be. So I will be reflecting on two issues. One is about the economic integration of Africa. Even all of us who are here today, how many transits did we make? How long have been we waiting at the airports to make transits? And when is really Africa connecting? We always talk about African continental free trade area, a lot of things, but this has never been changed. And I think the challenge is that governments in Africa are not responding to the needs of people. So why are we having regular elections? He was mentioning we are having elections only in very few African countries. We are able to move democratically. If you see the cost of election per voter, it is more than $7 to $10 per voter. Imagine how much bread can this buy, while we are not really having the real democracy in Africa. So the role of ECOSOC comes here, that we have to educate Africans in terms of demanding their rights, at the same time, status to respond to the needs of citizens. So, for instance, if you see only coffee, Ethiopia, Kenya, maybe Congo, and some African countries, we produce coffee, and the gain, the annual gain, is about $2.5 billion in the value chain and in the transaction. But only Germany makes more than $7 billion adding value only on coffee. So now we have the products here, but we are not benefiting from even African products. So where is the role of ECOSOC in terms of transforming the economy of Africans? Because unless we are economically powerful, we can't move on democratization, peace building, whatsoever. All corruption, these things come from poverty. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We had a last speaker from Sudan. I think she's here. We'll take the last one, and then we'll take reaction from our speaker.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. عبلة مهدي عبد المنعم، منظمة حواء. أولاً أشكر الإيكوسوك لاختياره الموفق في هذا البرزنتيشن الرائع من السيد برين. حقيقي جعلتني أشعر أن هنالك تغيير في سيستم الإيكوسوك، وأنه ستكون هنالك مبادرة من الإيكوسوك والمجتمع المدني الأفريقي لقيادة أفريقيا وللضغط على الحكومات لكي تغير الأسلوب الذي نتبعه، أن هنالك أطماع في مواردنا، أطماع في موارد أفريقيا، أطماع في ممتلكاتنا، مما تسبب نزاعات وحروب في دولنا نعاني منها في عدد من الدول الأفريقية. وتعلمون ما يحدث الآن في السودان من اغتصاب وقتل ودمار بسبب الإطماع على الموارد. فعلى الإيكوسوك أن يجعل هذه الورقة كمرجعية لعملنا المستقبلي من أجل تنمية أفريقيا لتحقيق الأمن والاستقرار والسلم والأمن لأفريقيا إن شاء الله. وعلينا أن نجعل هنالك تكتل اقتصادي قوي من أفريقيا وأن نوحد جهودنا وأن نعمل سويا ولا نجعل المجتمعات الغربية أن تفرق بيننا. علينا أن نكون أقوياء وأفريقيا قوية إن شاء الله، وإن شاء الله سيكون لأفريقيا دور كما للدول الصناعية الآن بإذن الله. إنني متفائلة. شكرا لكم.
Thank you very much for that as well. We would have taken more questions and reactions from colleagues here. Unfortunately, I'm being informed that we're facing some challenges in terms of the setup for our speaker to respond to these questions. We're trying to get him back online so that he responds to some of the issues that are raised. But with that and with time not being on our side, I do believe we can move into the next session of the program, and then we'll have him when he is available. Moving into the next session, again, I do believe we all have the program in front of us. We will be taking a briefing from the senior legal officer who is here with us, Mr. Legizabel Bekele. Mr. Legizabel, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Should I come there? Okay.
Please come here so that our colleagues can see you.
Thank you so much, my brother Bright. Good afternoon, everyone. Allow me to recognize the presence of the presiding officer and other invited guests here today. My name is Legizabel Bekele. I am the senior legal officer within the ECOSOCC Secretariat. My briefing with respect to the midterm election of ECOSOCC. As you know, and as it is a tradition, we undertake a midterm election to bring in CSOs from those member states that are either underrepresented or they don't have representation at all. So this year, we issued calls for nomination, call for application rather, to various member states who doesn't have representation or underrepresented within the 4th Permanent General Assembly for them to apply and be a member of the 4th Permanent General Assembly of ECOSOCC. In that regard, the call was issued, and then after we have organized a comprehensive evaluation of applications. In total, we received 41 applications vying for national level membership. In ECOSOCC, each member state of the Union, 55 in total, they have 2 quota at the national level. You are looking at in total 110 membership at the national level. And then we have what you call it regional membership. That is 10 in total, 2 per regions. In AU, we have 5 regions, so each region will have 2 regional membership. And we have also a continental membership, that is organizations working at the continental level to have the opportunity to participate in the ECOSOCC General Assembly. In that respect, of course, although we have had a number of applications for the national level, we've experienced challenges identifying or receiving applications for the regional and continental membership. We discovered that one of the challenges is registration, because if you are applying for a regional membership or continental, you are required to show registrations at least in 3 AU member states. And over the years, this has been a major challenge. It's very difficult to register a CSO in more than 1 member state. This challenge has always been there within ECOSOCC. Currently, we are reviewing the ECOSOCC statute, and we're trying to find ways and means to find another mechanism than registration to garner as many applications as possible for the regional and continental membership. But in this election, we received almost 35 applications for the national level application, and we received 6 applications for regional and continental level membership. Out of that, unfortunately, those 6 applications for regional and continental, although they meet most of the requirement, as I mentioned, but when it comes to the issue of additional registrations, that is where they mostly failed in terms of the eligibility requirement for membership. That is the legal framework we have currently, so it was very difficult for us to make any exemption. In this aspect, over the years, we try to take a bit of flexibility. For example, if they have partnership in Cameroon and say in Rwanda, we used to take that as a way of registration. But in 2022, there was an investigation by the Office of Internal Oversight that clearly indicated that it should be registration, and we cannot take either affiliation or partnership and whatever like terminology we should use. It should be registration because of accountability reasons. And for you to operate in a given member state, you need to have lawful presence. And for that to happen, the obvious evidence is that you have registered in that member state. So no one qualified for regional or continental membership. Then now coming back to the national level, that is where now we have new members who are elected into the 4th General Assembly. Out of the 36 applications we received, 17 of them met the eligibility requirement in terms of registration, in terms of submitting their constitutions, in terms of submitting financial report, audit reports, in terms of submitting list of their executive committee members, and in terms of also submitting any noticeable publication they have made as an organization working within the national boundaries. Out of those 17, now that met this high-level requirement, then we submitted their financial and audit reports to our finance and audit team to ensure that they comply with the financial and audit requirement. In AU, and as per the ECOSOCC statute, in terms of financial report, you are required to submit financial report for the last 3 years. So in this case, we are looking for financial report for 2023, 2021, and 2022. Similarly, there should be an independent audit report, audited by an independent audit firm rather, for the last 3 years. Again, the same physical period of 2023, 2022, and 2021. So for the national level, unfortunately, most of them failed because of financial and audit requirement. And specifically for the financial requirement, the reason for non-compliance is that the statute indicate that at least 50% of your operational budget or cost should come from internal sources. That means if you are coming from, for example, South Africa, your financial resources to basic financial resource, we're not referring to programmatic financial report, your basic financial resources to run the organ should come from, to run the organization should come from the local sources within South Africa. Also, if you have been funded by, for example, United Nations, if you have been funded by, say, African financial institutions, we make an exception, and we take it as part of local solicitation, just because as a member of UN, Ethiopia, Rwanda, South Sudan, they contribute. So whatever money we get from UN it assumed that it's locally sourced because it's the money contributed by our own member states. Similarly, from African Development Bank, from Afrexim Bank, and other financial institutions on the continent, if you received funding from those institutions, again, as a legal office, we interpreted that it's allowed and should be considered as a local source, because the intention is that some of this funding, if they're coming from foreign partners, they may hijack the narrative, and the independency of that organization might be compromised. That is the political consensus at the level of AU member states. So to avoid that, we try to really focus that as long as you're having a local funding for your basic resource. When we say basic, we're referring to perhaps salary, capital expenditure, and so on and so forth. And secondly is an audit report. So the issue of audit report for the last 3 years refers to audit report by an independent audit firm. So the challenge we've had is that we received an audit report done by an individual. So we do a bit of due diligence, and sometimes such organization doesn't exist in Ethiopia or in Uganda, or it's just an individual. It was very difficult to get, but in total, out of the 17, 11 met the financial